I adjusted the strap of my black evening gown as I stepped out of the town car, its polished leather interior still warm from the heat of my body. Henry barely glanced at me as he buttoned his tuxedo jacket, his attention fixed on the grand entrance of the Langston Hotel, where uplights bathed the columns in champagne gold. "Don't forget to smile," he muttered, his voice clipped, a warning disguised as a reminder. Tonight was supposed to be about celebrating our 6th anniversary and the continued success of Nexus Dynamics, the tech firm we'd built from nothing. Instead, I had discovered 2 hours ago that it would be the setting for my public execution. Before I continue narrating the story of Isabella Santos Martinez, please consider giving this video a like, share it, and subscribe to the channel. His phone had buzzed nonstop all afternoon, screen lighting up with Kristen Blackwood's name more times than I could count. She was Boston's most feared venture capitalist and Henry's boss, or rather, the woman he had apparently been collaborating with to humiliate me. I'd read every message on his phone while he showered, each text more brutal than the last, dissecting how to present me as emotionally unstable to the board. "Let her melt down in front of everyone," Kristen wrote. "It will validate the transfer of control we discussed." I didn't melt down. I memorized. I let every word sink in like a tattoo I'd never remove. Branding me with betrayal, I would turn into power. I zipped the black velvet box containing the vintage Omega watch. I bought him back into my clutch and walked with him into the hotel, my heels echoing on the marble like measured gunshots. The stage was set, and they thought I was the victim in their little play. Kristen stood at the center of the room, sipping champagne, her red gown shimmering like blood beneath the chandelier's golden light. She turned when she saw us and gave Henry a smile that was too wide, too intimate, as if I hadn't just walked in beside him. "You clean up well," she purred, ignoring me entirely. I responded with silence, offering her a glance as cold and sharp as the diamonds at her throat. Henry leaned over and kissed my cheek for the cameras, the lie glistening like sweat between us. The ballroom was filled with Boston's tech elite, investors, board members, rival CEOs, and journalists, everyone who mattered. I nodded politely as people greeted us, never letting my mask slip, even when their eyes lingered just a little too long on my expression, sensing tension they couldn't name. My assistant Sarah had texted me 3 times with updates on the neural network optimization issue, but I pretended not to care. That algorithm, my algorithm, was scheduled to roll out next quarter, but it was already showing signs of a breakthrough. If Kristen knew that, she'd push harder for a hostile acquisition. I saw Marcus Webb near the bar, Henry's assistant, his posture tense as he clutched a cocktail he clearly wasn't enjoying. His eyes met mine and flickered with something I couldn't quite read. Guilt, maybe, or panic. He turned away before I could confirm it, which told me everything. They were all in on it. Everyone except me. The head table glittered with gold flatware and personalized menus, my name embossed beside Henry's in a script that now felt like mockery. The speeches would begin after dessert, according to the itinerary Kristen had sent around, though I noticed I'd been removed from the agenda as co-founder. That had been quietly updated yesterday, while I was still revising Henry's talking points and submitting patent renewals under my name. Kristen had choreographed this entire night like a Broadway show, and I was the punchline, except I had the receipts and a legal foundation made of steel. I'd never forget what my grandmother Elena Santos wrote to me in her final letter. "Para mi neta, nunca dejes que roben tu trabajo. They will try to make you invisible. Don't let them." That inheritance of $3.2 million had seeded Nexus Dynamics when banks laughed us out of the room. Henry had brought charm and polished slides. I had brought code, patents, and generational sacrifice. He thought I didn't know that while he dazzled investors, I was too naive to realize the very foundation of his success was mine. I had written every core system Nexus used. I had architected every AI framework while he stood on stages parroting my discoveries. Tonight would be the last time anyone ever mistook his performance for my genius. The string quartet shifted into something upbeat as servers brought out dessert, a dark chocolate torte with gold leaf I'd signed off on 3 weeks ago. Henry reached for my hand under the table, a gesture that once would have meant something. I let him hold it. Let him believe for one more moment that he still had a partner instead of an adversary. Then Kristen stood up. She tapped her glass gently with a spoon, and the room fell silent. A hush rolled over the ballroom like fog, and every head turned toward her as she stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice smooth as silk soaked in venom. "Tonight we celebrate not just Nexus Dynamics, unprecedented success, but the people who made it possible." I held my breath, fingers tightening around the box in my clutch. Here it comes, I thought, the opening act of my annihilation. I could practically hear her script in my head before she spoke it. "But some partnerships," she continued, "transcend business. They become transformative, revolutionary, and I believe in rewarding that kind of rare, fearless connection." The room shifted, shoulders squared. People turned, sensing something more than just corporate praise coming. Kristen stepped down from the stage. In 4-inch heels, she crossed the floor like a queen approaching her throne. She stopped in front of our table, in front of Henry, and slowly, deliberately, she dropped to one knee. Gasps rippled like aftershocks. "I want the world to know what we already do," she said into the microphone, her eyes locked on Henry, the moment radiating rehearsed perfection. "Henry Martinez, will you leave your poor, impotent wife and marry me?" Silence. The kind that follows a gunshot. The kind that destroys everything that came before it. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Henry's face, but it vanished almost instantly beneath a smile that made my blood run cold. He stood slowly, as if savoring the moment, as if rehearsing the scene in his mind one last time. The entire ballroom held its collective breath as he leaned forward, took Kristen's hand and said, "Yes." The word landed with a finality that echoed off marble and crystal, sealing 6 years of marriage into a tomb of public spectacle. Cameras flashed as though this were a royal engagement, not the violent unraveling of a betrayal 6 months in the making. I didn't cry. I didn't scream or throw my drink in anyone's face. That would have completed their scene, fed into the performance they had scripted for me like some jilted soap opera wife. Instead, I stood up calmly, my chair scraping the polished floor with the clarity of a judge's gavel. I adjusted the strap of my dress, picked up my clutch, and walked away without a word. The entire room parted like the Red Sea, not from respect, but from morbid curiosity. Every eye followed me, not toward the stage but the exit, anticipating tears or a dramatic collapse that never came. I gave them none of it. No breakdown, no spectacle. Just the unsettling grace of a woman who had already made her decision hours ago. Kristen's voice faltered behind me as I reached the ballroom doors, calling my name like a taunt instead of an apology. "Isabella, don't be dramatic," she laughed, but her tone cracked under the weight of uncertainty. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. Because if Kristen Blackwood had bothered to read the actual incorporation papers of Nexus Dynamics, she would have known that I wasn't just the wife Henry discarded. I was the company's majority owner. By the time I reached the hotel's private valet entrance, I had already opened the encrypted Vault app on my phone. It required biometric access, retina scan, and thumbprint, a system I had developed myself back when we still believed in security through partnership. Within seconds, I had activated the lockout protocol. All financial accounts, server systems, vendor access, and API tokens connected to my side of the Nexus Dynamics network were frozen. The $207 million in liquid assets I controlled were now legally and operationally mine alone. The valet tried to hand me my keys with a tremble in his hand, clearly having seen something on the ballroom monitors. "Are you okay, ma'am?" he asked, voice low, uncertain whether to speak to me as a victim or a CEO. "I'm excellent," I said, taking the keys and offering him a tip large enough to ensure silence. I slid into the driver's seat of the Porsche Taycan I had purchased under the Nexus R&D budget, still well within ethical standards, given I had designed every proprietary subsystem it now ran. Kristen and Henry didn't know it yet, but the engine of their betrayal had just stalled. Boston blurred past in streaks of gold and blue, streetlights painting my windshield like constellations collapsing in fast motion. I could feel the pressure in my chest beginning to shift, not from panic, but from the release that comes when you finally stop pretending. The anniversary gift sat beside me on the passenger seat. unopened and silent now. The Omega watch that once symbolized love now ticked inside its box like a countdown to their downfall. My fingers tapped the steering wheel as I drove, calculating, always calculating. When I reached the penthouse, the skyline reflected in the windows like a blade waiting to fall. I opened the front door, silence greeting me like a loyal friend, and went straight to the living room. The painting above the fireplace, the one Henry had insisted on buying from some overpriced gallery, hung crookedly, and for some reason that irritated me more than anything else tonight. I fixed it with a deliberate tug, then opened the wall safe behind it. Inside were the original incorporation papers, signed in ink by both of us, mine written with vision, his with borrowed confidence. The numbers didn't lie, even if the man did. My 67% ownership of Nexus Dynamics came from Isabella Santos. Legacy, converted into startup capital the moment I left Harvard Law to pursue machine learning full-time. Henry had brought ambition and charm, but I brought the code, the patents, the prototypes, and the clients. Every contract, every filing, every foundational asset bore my name, Isabella Santos Martinez, spelled out in crisp black ink that no charm could erase. The world had seen Henry's face at the galas, but they'd been using my architecture all along. My laptop glowed to life on the kitchen island, connecting to Nexus servers through a secure channel even Henry didn't know existed. The command prompt waited like a loaded gun. I typed in the kill command, ndx shutdown priv, Isabella 67, and watched as access permissions cascaded downward, logging out every executive, including Henry, from the mainframe. Kristen's consulting agreements, which I had quietly flagged for irregular review last month, were automatically voided. Audit logs triggered compliance reviews that would hit before dawn, exposing every misuse of company funds from the past 18 months. Notifications exploded across my phone like fireworks. Security pings, automated fraud alerts, suspended contracts. Marcus Webb tried calling me 5 times in a row, but I let it go to voicemail. Then Sarah Kim messaged. The entire ops team just got locked out. Henry is panicking. Should I execute contingency Bravo? I replied with one word, yes. Sarah's loyalty had never been to Henry, and now it would be rewarded. Contingency Bravo wasn't about destruction. It was about clarity. It rerouted all core projects through encrypted silos. Only I controlled and sent automated alerts to the board citing unauthorized third-party interference. It sent legal summaries to the firm's attorneys, filed breach notices with the SEC, and reclassified Kristen's investment as disruptive under shareholder protection clauses. It was the kind of digital judo only the actual architect of Nexus Dynamics could perform. And I had written the code myself at 3 in the morning, while Henry had been in bed texting Kristen. With everything in motion, I finally sat down. Just sat. No alarms, no rage. Just the steady hum of justice unfolding through fiber optics and legal firewalls. Tonight, they thought they'd taken everything from me, and all they did was hand me the perfect excuse to take it all back. The next morning, sunlight poured through the penthouse windows like nothing had happened, but the air felt different, cleaner, sharper. I sipped coffee from the same mug I used during late-night coding marathons, the handle worn from years of use. Notifications buzzed non-stop on my phone, vibrating against the marble countertop like a warning drum. Sarah texted that Henry had arrived at the office at 6:42 a.m., only to find his badge deactivated and security waiting. He demanded access, but the system had already reclassified him as a non-employee, pending investigation. Kristen, according to the internal chatter Sarah relayed, hadn't shown up at all. Her consulting credentials had expired at 12:01 a.m., down to the second, leaving her locked out of both our digital platforms and the building itself. No one dared to override the protocols, because they couldn't. The system was too tightly woven into my biometric and encrypted keys, with security levels based on the earliest structures I'd coded at Nexus's inception. Sarah's final message said it best. They look like kids who just realized their parents changed the locks. I let them panic. There would be no press release, no emergency meeting with the board. Not yet. I wanted them to feel the weight of their decisions in every locked door and denied access screen. If they wanted answers, they'd have to come to me now, and not as equals. At 9:13 a.m., the penthouse intercom buzzed. I walked over slowly, every step echoing off marble as I tapped the screen. Mrs. Martinez. Patrick, our lobby concierge, said with a voice tinged with hesitation. Marcus Webb is here to see you. He says it's urgent. He's visibly upset. I told Patrick to send him up. When the elevator doors opened, Marcus stepped out looking like he hadn't slept, tie crooked, hair disheveled, phone clutched in a death grip. Mrs. Martinez, he said breathlessly, eyes wide. We need help. The company's frozen. Vendors are calling nonstop. Payroll failed, and Henry is spiraling. Kristen hasn't returned any calls, and no one can figure out why everything's failing. I motioned for him to sit on the leather couch Henry once claimed was just for investor meetings, and I placed a folder on the coffee table between us. Marcus hesitated, clearly trying to gauge what role I was playing in all this. I didn't speak until he opened the folder. His hands shook as he flipped through the pages. Legal documentation, forensic accounting, company bylaws. And finally, the statement of immediate restructuring under majority stakeholder authority. You froze him out, he whispered. You froze them both out. His voice wasn't angry, just stunned. But how? Kristen's the most powerful VC in Boston. She has backing from everyone. Everyone, I corrected, except the woman who built the company from scratch. I explained it with the calm of someone who had spent years preparing for a moment like this. 67% ownership. Patent control. Founder privileges encoded into every contract and every line of back-end authorization. Marcus stared at the papers as if they were written in a language he didn't know existed. But Henry, he said he had plans, that the board was on his side. Henry had access. I cut in. Not ownership. I handed him a second folder, this one thinner, containing a single sheet of paper. Henry's severance agreement. No payout, no perks. Just a clean break under breach of fiduciary duty. It was the same paper Kristen would receive later today, via courier. Marcus stood to leave, his expression dazed. What should I tell them, he asked, voice soft, like a child caught in a firestorm he hadn't started. Tell them, I said, that when you mistake proximity for power, you eventually meet the architect. The elevator doors closed on him like the final punctuation of a paragraph. By 2 p.m., the media frenzy had begun. One of the junior engineers had leaked the internal memo I sent out re-establishing Nexus leadership under my sole authority. TechPulse ran the headline first. Isabella Martinez reclaims Nexus, CEO aftermath of gala scandal. By evening, CNBC had picked it up, broadcasting a segment with grainy footage from the hotel where Kristen had proposed. Her question, will you leave your poor, impotent wife and marry me, looped on national television like the chorus of a revenge opera. I watched it all from my sofa with a cup of tea and the vintage Omega watch still unopened on the table. The irony wasn't lost on me. That watch had cost $25,000 and represented every ounce of trust I'd placed in Henry. Now it was a monument to that trust's destruction and the beginning of my empire's rebirth. The board called an emergency session that evening, every member visibly shaken by the week's events. I didn't attend in person. I sent a pre-recorded video that outlined the facts. My ownership, my patents, my plan. It ended with me saying, effective immediately, all financial authority reverts to the original founder per incorporation terms signed in 2017. This is not a hostile takeover. This is a recalibration to reality. They voted 9-1 in favor of restructuring, the lone holdout being a VC who'd sided with Kristen from the start. He resigned the next morning. Kristen issued a statement through her firm claiming the proposal was taken out of context and intended as a lighthearted joke. The internet disagreed. Thousands of shares, meme edits, and reaction videos said otherwise. Even her investors weren't buying the backpedal. Henry tried calling me 17 times. I never answered, not because I had nothing to say, but because I had already said everything through action. He texted once, a single sentence, You're destroying everything we built." I stared at it for a long time before replying, "We didn't build it. I did." The next morning, Sarah and I finalized the asset transfers. Every dollar from my 67%, over $207 million, was moved into a new structure, Quantum Forward Holdings. It would focus on machine learning innovation, ethical AI, and medical diagnostic applications. Sarah would be CTO. I would be CEO. And Henry? He would be listed in the system as former employee. No titles, no access, no edit rights, just a footnote. The first few weeks after the restructuring were a storm of paperwork, interviews, and public recalibration. But beneath it all, I felt something strange. Peace. For the first time in years, no one interrupted me mid-sentence to simplify my ideas for investors. No one double-checked my numbers as if the PhD I didn't bother to frame meant nothing. And no one called me just the co-founder's wife. I was finally being addressed as what I had always been: the architect, the innovator, the owner. Sarah and I met with our new legal team at Quantum Forward Holdings in a modest but sharp office downtown. We could have leased half of the financial district, but I didn't want polished lies anymore. I wanted functionality. The lawyers reviewed our IP assets, smiling as they confirmed that 92% of Nexus's core technology now lived under my name through strategic transfers. The rest, held in limbo by Kristen's dormant contracts, would expire within 90 days. Every expiration date felt like a countdown to total freedom. I didn't announce Quantum Forward to the world with a gala or a press event. I announced it by filing a $207 million corporate endowment to fund innovation in ethical AI. I called it the Isabella Santos Initiative in honor of the woman who once scrubbed hospital floors and taught herself BASIC in the 1980s just so she could teach it to me. I released the news via a quiet Medium post. No photos, no video, just the truth. Within 48 hours, we had partnerships with 3 hospitals and 2 university labs. Kristen responded through back channels, of course. She contacted Sarah twice, once to threaten legal action and once to offer a personal conversation. Sarah forwarded both emails to our lawyers and marked her address as spam. Then she poured us both espresso and said, "I don't know how you ever sat across from that woman without flipping a table." I didn't answer right away because the truth was, I had once admired Kristen. But admiration is just trust's disguise when the person you admire turns out to be a predator. Henry, meanwhile, had disappeared from public view. Tech journals reported he was on sabbatical, while gossip blogs speculated about the proposal heard around the world. His face trended on social media every time a new remix of Kristen's proposal went viral. I didn't respond to the attention, didn't correct any narratives, because the silence spoke louder than anything I could write. And because the truth was, Henry didn't matter anymore. What mattered was what came next. Sarah and I began interviewing engineers, scientists, and developers for our new product, a diagnostic AI model for detecting rare diseases. We weren't chasing social media buzz or quarterly returns. We were chasing elegance, mathematical precision that could save lives. The algorithm I was building didn't need applause, it needed accuracy. One night, while reviewing neural net weights from a batch test, I heard a knock at the penthouse door. It was late, too late for deliveries, and security always called first. I opened the door without checking the peephole because some part of me already knew who it would be. Henry stood there, his tie undone and his eyes hollow. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Isabella," he said, his voice rough from disuse or regret. I couldn't tell which. "Can I come in?" I stared at him for a moment and then stepped aside, letting him walk into what used to be our shared kingdom. He didn't glance around, didn't try to make small talk. He just walked to the window, looking out over the harbor, as if it might hold answers he could no longer find in me. "I lost everything," he said quietly. "I thought I could control it, but Kristen turned on me the minute you locked her out." His shoulders slumped like he was shrinking into himself. "She said I was never the plan. just a way to pressure you." I stayed silent, letting him fill the quiet with his own confessions. "She told me I'd be the face of Nexus," he continued. "But she said it wouldn't mean anything unless you were out of the way." He turned to face me, eyes rimmed red, voice cracking. "I never thought you'd actually leave." "I didn't leave," I said, my voice like stone. "I walked away from what was never real." He sat down on the couch, the same place Marcus had sat with trembling hands weeks earlier. "I was wrong," he said. "I should have told you what she was planning." His hands twisted in his lap, nervous and raw. "But I thought if I went along with it, we'd be stronger after." "You thought betrayal would strengthen us?" I asked, my tone unchanging. "That's not strategy, Henry. That's cowardice." "I deserve all of this," he admitted. "But I need you to understand. I was scared." I raised an eyebrow. "Of what?" He exhaled slowly, like the truth was a weight. "Of being irrelevant." Those words hit harder than anything else he'd said that night. "I watched you code entire systems in a weekend. I watched you explain things to investors they couldn't even pronounce. And I realized they weren't coming for me. They were coming for you." Kristen saw it too. He looked up at me, searching for something. "Mercy, maybe." "I was jealous," he whispered. "Jealous that you didn't need me to be brilliant." I didn't flinch. I didn't comfort him. I just stood there, watching a man finally see himself without my reflection to validate him. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said, standing slowly. "But I wanted you to know I'm sorry, for all of it." He walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the knob. "The world should have always known who the real genius was." Then he left. The silence that followed was sharp but clean. No apology could rewrite what he had done, but something about hearing it, raw and unvarnished, let me finally close the last door he still had keys to in my mind. I turned back to my desk and clicked back into the neural net interface. There was work to do, and no time left for ghosts. Before I narrate what happens next, please leave a comment on Isabella's moves so far, and let me know why you haven't subscribed yet. The days after Henry's late-night apology moved forward with the unrelenting rhythm of code, one line at a time. I didn't tell Sarah he came by, not because I was hiding it, but because it no longer mattered to the path we were on. Quantum Forward was becoming something real, something cleaner than anything Nexus had ever been. Instead of publicists and partnerships that diluted vision, we had clarity. Each team member brought curiosity, not ego, and our product roadmap followed data, not the whims of venture capitalists with champagne agendas. The Isabella Santos initiative gained traction faster than expected, in part because I refused to attach my face to it. Universities respected that. They wanted research, not headlines. One MIT lab offered to co-develop diagnostic tools based on our predictive imaging model, and within a month, we had 5 pilot hospitals running silent tests. Early feedback showed a 28% improvement in rare disease identification, something that would have taken Nexus 3 more funding rounds and a scandal to approve. I worked 10-hour days, but they didn't feel heavy. There were no staged investor lunches, no photo shoots, no forced gala gowns, just architecture, refinement, and the occasional Zoom call with people who asked good questions because they wanted to learn, not because they were rehearsing sound bites. Sarah handled operations while I led engineering, and together we created something honest, something that worked. Then came the email from a law firm representing a VC consortium formerly connected to Kristen. They requested a meeting, off the record, private and exploratory. Sarah forwarded it to me with a note. "Sounds like they're scared. Your move." I stared at it for a long time before replying. "Schedule it, but I'm not going there." They come to us. We met in the second-floor conference room of our Cambridge office, a modest space with whiteboards covered in formulas and coffee rings on the table from real work, not performative productivity. 3 men and 1 woman arrived in tailored suits, expressions strained by politeness. "Thank you for seeing us," the lead attorney said, sitting with an expensive briefcase he didn't open. "We're hoping for a conversation about what comes next." I didn't respond. I waited. The silence stretched. Eventually, the woman among them cleared her throat. Kristen Blackwood's investment group no longer wishes to pursue any stake in Nexus Dynamics or Quantum Forward Holdings, she said carefully. She has stepped down from several advisory boards and is considering relocation. Sarah blinked once, then calmly took notes. I said nothing because the absence of a threat already confirmed our victory. She overreached, the man added, and she underestimated your position. That was an understatement wrapped in apology, delivered with the smooth tone of someone hoping I'd offer clemency. We're here because we want to avoid protracted litigation and reputational fallout. I folded my hands on the table. Then don't invest in people who build castles on someone else's code. They left shortly after, and Sarah tossed the business cards they left on the table into the recycling bin without asking if I wanted them. They'll come back in a year under different names, she said. But they'll know better next time. I nodded, satisfied. Sometimes you don't need to destroy your enemies. You just need them to remember your name in every boardroom they enter from now on. 3 months later, Nexus Dynamics quietly announced Henry's official resignation from all residual corporate duties. The press barely noticed. Most of the public still believed I'd been the genius all along, especially after my open-source paper on neural interpretability gained traction among machine learning scholars. Kristen's firm was removed from 2 advisory boards, and her name disappeared from the invite lists of tech conferences that once fought to feature her. Henry, last I heard, had moved to Portland and was teaching entrepreneurship at a community college. I didn't hate him. I didn't even pity him. He had played a part one no longer needed in a story that was never really about him. Now I was writing my own chapters without anyone else holding the pen. And that chapter included something new, legacy. My grandmother's legacy lived in the name of our initiative, but mine needed something more tangible. So I began designing the Isabella Fellowship, a yearly grant and mentorship program for underrepresented women in AI and systems architecture, not to tell them how to think, but to protect them when the world tried to forget they were thinking at all. We launched with 3 fellows, each brilliant, each invisible in places they should have been celebrated. That would end under my watch. At the fellowship announcement event, small, humble, full of real code and chalkboards, I finally wore the Omega watch. It wasn't about Henry anymore. It was a reminder that sometimes the gift you buy and love can still have meaning after betrayal, just in a different shape. It sat on my wrist as I handed out the awards, ticking not with time, but with reclamation, not a countdown, just a rhythm. One of the fellows, Lila, approached me afterward, eyes bright, smile unsure. "You really wrote that 2018 white paper on layered interpretability models?" she asked. I smiled and nodded. "It changed how I think about architecture," she said. "I used to think I had to dumb things down just to get funding." "Never again," I told her. "Let your work speak before your mouth ever does." When the event ended and the lights dimmed, I lingered in the room alone. Not because I was sad, because I was full of memory, full of clarity, full of proof that walking away from someone doesn't mean walking away from yourself. Sometimes you have to lose everything staged to finally stand in what's real. And I was finally, beautifully real. 6 months after the fellowship launch, Quantum Forward had grown into something more than I ever envisioned when I walked out of that ballroom. The team had doubled in size, not from pressure, but from purpose. Every hire was intentional, every system built to last. Sarah handled hiring with a ferocity that matched her brilliance, personally reviewing every portfolio to ensure integrity over pedigree. Our offices buzzed with quiet determination, whiteboards covered in equations instead of slogans. We weren't chasing headlines. We were chasing health outcomes, predictive power, and dignity. Hospitals began submitting clinical data through our secure API, trusting our model with lives rather than likes. The diagnostic engine we built, Veritas, identified obscure conditions with unmatched accuracy, and we published our findings in peer-reviewed journals instead of paid press releases. Sarah and I often sat late at night, refining deployment protocols, updating interpretability filters, and laughing about how we used to spend nights designing for people who never understood what we did. "I'd forgotten what it felt like to solve something without explaining it to someone in a suit," she said one night, sipping tea. "Now the only performance we care about is precision and recall." Meanwhile, Nexus Dynamics limped on like a hollow replica of its former self. Without Kristen, Henry, or my patents, the board had pivoted toward enterprise software, stripping it of everything that once made it revolutionary. Their valuation dropped 32% over the next 2 quarters, and layoffs quietly hit departments I had once built from scratch. The irony was brutal but clean. What they thought they could copy, they never really understood. Marcus reached out once with a polite message congratulating me on Veritas's publication in Nature AI. I thanked him but didn't ask how Nexus was doing. I already knew. My personal life remained simple. Deliberately so. The Cambridge townhouse I'd moved into after leaving the penthouse was quiet, with wide windows and bookshelves filled with things I actually read. I'd sold the vintage furniture Henry picked out to impress investors and replaced it with reclaimed oak, hand-built by a local carpenter who'd never once asked what I did for a living. My days were structured but free. Code in the morning, meetings in the afternoon, and long walks by the Charles River when I needed clarity. There was no staff, no performance, no pretending, just the rhythm of a life I'd designed on my own terms. One crisp Saturday morning, I received a letter, not a text, not an email, but a handwritten envelope with my full name in cursive. The return address was from Oregon. It was from Henry. I stared at it for a long moment before opening it, not with dread, but curiosity. Inside was a single-page letter, written in ink with an unfamiliar hesitation in his strokes. It read like someone who'd finally stopped trying to sound clever and started trying to be honest. He said Portland was gray but healing. He said he'd been teaching entrepreneurship at a local community college and that his students were smarter than he ever gave them credit for. They asked questions I used to dodge, he wrote, like how to build something without lying about who built it. He admitted that teaching made him face himself in ways that fame never had. I realize now, he wrote, that I was never the visionary. I was the voice actor reading your script. And when the voice left, so did the story. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't even ask to talk. He just said thank you for showing him the cost of arrogance and the power of truth. I didn't respond. There was no need. Sometimes the only reply necessary is the quiet continuation of a life you were once told you couldn't lead alone. And mine had become so whole, his absence no longer felt like subtraction. It felt like space reclaimed. Later that month, I was invited to deliver a keynote at an international AI symposium in Zurich. It was the kind of platform Kristen used to chase relentlessly, the kind Henry would have turned into a photo shoot. I declined the spotlight portion and offered instead to lead a panel on ethical interpretability in medical datasets. The organizers were surprised but respectful, and when I arrived, the room was full, not of journalists, but of engineers, researchers, and students with notepads instead of cameras. The conversation was technical, layered, and real. After the panel, a young researcher named Hina approached me. She was from Mumbai and had built a machine learning model that predicted early signs of gestational diabetes using only public health data. "No one takes it seriously back home," she said. "They say it's just pregnancy. But it nearly killed my cousin." I asked to see her architecture, and she emailed it that night. By morning, I'd sent her a formal invitation to collaborate with Quantum Forward. This was the work I lived for now. Not acquisition, not power, not retribution, but elevation. The quiet revolution of making sure the next Hina, the next Sarah, the next Isabella never had to beg for a seat at a table they had already built. And when I returned home to Boston, Sarah greeted me with a grin. "Veritas just crossed its 100th confirmed life saved," she said. "Hospitals are asking to license it under open source conditions. You ready to redefine healthcare?" I was. Because healing wasn't just for patients. It was for people like me. People who once had to watch their names vanish from things they created. People who survived the performance. People who built, in silence, systems stronger than betrayal. Now those systems were saving lives. And no one could take that from me. By the time winter settled over Boston, Veritas had been adopted by 14 hospitals across 3 countries. The first year's data was conclusive. Diagnostic accuracy had improved by 31% in low-resource settings, and our interpretability engine became the benchmark for regulatory compliance. We had managed to prove that ethical AI wasn't just a philosophy. It was scalable, profitable, and necessary. Sarah and I stood in the middle of our new data center, watching engineers install the final racks, our breath visible in the chilled air. "From your grandmother's legacy to this," she whispered, her voice full of wonder. I thought of Isabella Santos every day now, not just when I walked past her framed letter, but in the architecture of everything we built. She taught me systems thinking before I knew that's what it was, explaining how the world doesn't reward effort, only outcomes. And yet, she made sure I knew how to build outcomes no one could take credit for unless I allowed it. That lesson had carried me through betrayal, into resilience, and finally into this, a place where my work lived outside of me and served more than my name. We launched our next phase of the initiative under a code name Elena would have loved, Cosecha, Spanish for harvest. It was a federated learning project designed to allow hospitals to train shared models without ever transferring patient data. The idea wasn't just technically innovative, it was legally and ethically transformative, especially in underserved regions wary of Western data mining. We brought in Hina from Mumbai and a new partner from Nairobi named Kendi, both of whom helped tailor the architecture to meet local needs. Our first trial went live in 6 clinics across South Asia and East Africa within 4 months. As Quantum Forward expanded, I kept the team lean and focused. We turned down 2 acquisition offers and 1 merger proposal, each one promising accelerated growth in exchange for strategic dilution. Sarah laughed when she read those emails, sliding them into a folder she titled Delusion Pitches. I refused to let the same mistakes that happened at Nexus repeat themselves here. We didn't need validation through scale. We needed sustainability through clarity. Then, one evening in late February, I received another unexpected letter, this time from Kristen. It came via certified mail, printed on her firm's old letterhead, now mostly dissolved following her removal from multiple investment boards. Inside was a 3-paragraph note that felt less like an apology and more like a confession, written under the weight of consequence. She admitted to orchestrating the proposal, admitted to manipulating Henry, admitted to treating me as a legal obstacle rather than a human being. "I underestimated your silence," she wrote, "and I mistook your professionalism for passivity." She closed the letter with no signature, just the initials KB written in a style so small I had to squint to see it. I scanned it into our system, encrypted it, and filed it away, not as leverage, but as proof. Not every war needs a counterattack. Some only require records. That spring, I was invited to guest lecture at Harvard, my first time returning since I left law to study machine learning on my own. The irony wasn't lost on me as I stood in the same halls where I once felt like a misfit, lecturing to a packed room on ethical systems governance. I opened with a quote from Elena, projected in clean white letters on a black slide. "Build something that matters, and never let anyone take credit for your work." Some students wrote it down like scripture, others simply stared. During Q&A, one student raised her hand, her voice cautious. "What advice would you give someone who's afraid of being overshadowed?" I paused before answering, choosing each word with care. "The sun doesn't compete with shadows," I said. "It just keeps rising." A few students smiled. One cried. I walked back to my townhouse that evening as snow flurries drifted down in soft spirals. Inside, everything smelled like cedar and clean linen, warm from the radiator heat and quiet from the life I'd curated around purpose instead of noise. The Omega watch still sat in a glass case on my bookshelf, but I hadn't worn it in months. It had served its purpose, closure, and now it existed as history. My real-time pieces were the systems we'd built, ticking through terabytes of data, saving lives one prediction at a time. Sarah came by the next morning with coffee and news. "Stanford wants to license Veritas for a pilot project in their surgical triage wing," she said, sliding her laptop onto the kitchen table. "They want to co-author the study with you." I looked over the documents, scanning for red flags, but found none. Let's do it, I said, on our terms. We signed the agreement 2 days later. The contract stipulated open research, full model transparency, and co-authorship for the engineering team, not just the executives. It was the kind of clause I'd never seen in my Nexus days, because it prioritized creators over CEOs. Sarah toasted the deal with ginger tea instead of champagne, and we spent the evening cleaning out old files from our shared drive. "Let's retire the original prototype repository," she said, "before we end up like them, holding on to ghosts." That night, I opened my grandmother's last letter again. The edges were soft from handling, the ink slightly faded, but the words were as sharp as ever. "Para mi neta verante, no dejes que el mundo te haga pequeña. No naciste para sus moldes." It meant, "Little spark, don't let the world make you small. You weren't born for their molds." I had built a company, a system, and a legacy in defiance of every mold I'd been forced into. The next morning, our system flagged a new data anomaly, a small but consistent signature in neonatal diagnostic datasets. It could be noise, or it could be something new, something no one had found before, something that might save children not yet born. I leaned in, opened the data feed, and started to write. The anomaly was subtle, an unexpected clustering pattern in low-weight infants that hadn't triggered any of our previous filters. It wasn't just a fluke in the model or a rounding error. It was something deeper. I reran the simulation using a separate training dataset and found the same deviation. The signals were consistent across geography, language, and clinic size, which meant it wasn't a regional artifact. It was something real, and it had been missed by every major system before ours. Sarah joined me within 20 minutes of my message, already sipping her second coffee and pulling her hair into a bun. "Walk me through it," she said, and I did. Every node, every weight adjustment, every inference path. She sat in silence for a while, scrolling through the visuals, then muttered, "This could be a predictive flag for pre-failure cardiac tissue development. No one's ever modeled that this early." I nodded. "It's not a prediction, it's a warning system. A whisper, not a scream." We pulled in Hina, who verified the trend from her end, using her clinic's anonymized data. Candy confirmed it again from Nairobi the following day, and by the end of the week, we had 12 sites showing similar patterns. No published literature addressed it, and no FDA-approved systems had flagged it before. Sarah assembled a task force, pulling 3 engineers from the Veritas team and assigning them to Cosecha under high-priority protocol. We called the initiative Project Sutura, a name Elena would have appreciated. It meant suture in Latin, a stitch that holds something vulnerable together. I didn't sleep much that month. We rewrote diagnostic pathways, revalidated training sets, and double-checked model biases across demographic dimensions. There were tears some nights, of exhaustion, of awe, of sheer gravity at what we were unlocking. But there was never doubt. Every time I saw those curves align across cultures and languages, I knew we were on the edge of something extraordinary. And then came the email from Stanford. Their team had not only replicated our findings in their triage unit, but had flagged 3 early-stage cases using our prototype. One infant had already been stabilized before critical failure, thanks to a simple alert that read, "Risk elevation detected. Seek echocardiogram within 12 hours." That one message changed everything. The child lived, and Veritas became undeniable. When the story broke in The Lancet, Sarah and I didn't celebrate. We exhaled. We had spent years fighting for the right to be believed, and now our work was speaking in the universal language of saved lives. No awards could top that. No spotlight could replace the gravity of knowing your code beat time in a race no one else realized had started. We stood in the server room that night, watching the heartbeat of our system ripple through encrypted nodes like a living organism. "We're going to need more engineers," Sarah whispered. I smiled. "We're going to need a whole new category." Investors began circling again, this time more cautiously, with tones that hinted at respect rather than entitlement. Sarah filtered them with surgical precision, taking only the meetings we initiated and rejecting any offer that used the word leverage. I set our terms clearly: no board seats without technical contributions, no PR directives, and full academic transparency for every model iteration. Some left. The right ones stayed. One day, my assistant forwarded a new name requesting a meeting. Dr. Henry Martinez, Portland Community College. He had submitted a proposal for a research collaboration using Veritas Lite, a stripped-down open-source branch we had released for educational institutions. Sarah raised an eyebrow, waiting for me to react. I read the request twice, noting that it contained no appeal to our history, no trace of familiarity, just code, test results, and a single paragraph describing a student-led initiative to identify diagnostic delays in rural clinics. I approved it without comment. We assigned one of our newer engineers, Devin, to support his team remotely. Devin never mentioned Henry by name, only referred to him as the adjunct advisor with decent documentation habits. I never intervened. He was just one of hundreds now using our tools, not because of who he used to be, but because the system worked. That was enough. Summer bloomed in Cambridge with quiet warmth. We moved into a new workspace. Nothing flashy, just more room, more light, more whiteboards. I kept my desk by the window, the same battered laptop at the center, stickers peeling at the corners from years of quiet revolution. Elena's photo sat beside it, framed in steel, watching like a guardian of all that came before. Some mornings, I'd look at her and whisper, "We did it." Sarah suggested hosting a celebration, not for us, but for the fellows and contributors around the world. We called it the Asamblea, Spanish for gathering, and invited everyone from Hina to Kendi to the Stanford neonatal team. There were no suits, no stage, no sponsors. Just people, laptops, shared datasets, and storyboards mapping the future of diagnostics. We held it in an old library, repurposed as a digital commons, sunlight pouring through high-arched windows as we sketched, shared, and dreamed. That night, as the last of the charts were erased and chairs were stacked, I stood in the doorway and watched it all. A room once designed to hold silence now echoed with the energy of creation. Every face in that room had shaped what we built, not just through code, but through faith. They had trusted the math, trusted me, and in return I had given them what I was once denied, ownership without conditions. Later, Sarah handed me a small box. It wasn't a watch. It wasn't jewelry. It was a hand-bound journal, filled with notes and sketches from the entire Veritas team. On the inside cover, they had written a single line, for Isabella, whose silence never meant absence. I didn't cry. Not there. Not then. But later, alone, I opened the last page, and I began to write again. The journal became my morning ritual, a quiet space where I reflected on progress not measured by press or revenue, but by patterns solved and futures changed. I wrote about Kendi's hospital, where the new model we deployed was catching maternal warning signs even experienced physicians sometimes missed. I wrote about Hina's paper being accepted into NeurIPS, her name now carried with the respect it always deserved. I even wrote about the silence from Henry, which had remained unbroken since his collaboration request was approved without comment. He had become what he should have always been, someone learning from systems smarter than him. Veritas was now running across 23 countries, supporting thousands of diagnostics daily without a single commercial ad campaign. Its adoption had become organic, passed from clinic to clinic like trusted knowledge. We never chased customers. We equipped partners. We never sold influence. We earned it through accuracy. And that, more than any acquisition or headline, was the proof of vision fulfilled. In July, the WHO requested a consultation. They had been monitoring our models through their internal AI working group and wanted us to advise on a new global standard for machine learning in public health. Sarah and I flew to Geneva on a red-eye, laptops in hand and zero entourage. This is the first time I've seen a governing body that doesn't want to own the tech. Just understand it, she whispered as we stepped into the stone building. And for once, the questions they asked weren't about margins or market share. They were about method. We presented our architecture in a room that once held arguments about pandemics and vaccines, not math and modular weights. But the spirit was the same. How do you build something that protects the most people with the fewest assumptions? I explained how Veritas, layered interpretability, allowed each hospital to retrace decisions in human-readable form. Sarah broke down the safeguard protocols that blocked external overrides, even if someone tried to manipulate outputs. At the end, a gray-haired analyst from Copenhagen leaned back and said, "This should have been the standard 5 years ago." On the flight back, Sarah stared out the window for a long time before turning to me. "You realize what you did, right?" she asked. "You wrote justice into code. You took every courtroom they would have denied you and built one they couldn't reach." I didn't answer. I just nodded, letting the clouds below carry the weight of her words. When we landed, I found another letter waiting for me, this time with no return address. The handwriting was familiar but thinner, like it had aged with the writer. Inside was a folded photo. Henry standing with 3 students, one of whom held a printed copy of our open-source paper. Beneath it, in quiet ink, was a sentence, "I teach them better now." It didn't ask for a response. It didn't need one. I placed the photo behind Elena's letter on my bookshelf, not out of forgiveness, but out of closure. Redemption, after all, wasn't mine to give. It was his to live. And if he was choosing to teach instead of perform, that was more than I ever expected. I turned back to my desk, where Cosecha's model logs were already updating with new patient feedback from Bangladesh and rural Spain. The system was alive, and I had work to do. Autumn crept into Cambridge with its usual quiet elegance, red ivy crawling up brick walls, air crisp with clarity. We released Veritas 4.0 without fanfare, the update notes published on GitHub, and translated into 6 languages by volunteers who once used our API in silent gratitude. Kendi submitted our first co-authored case study to the African Journal of AI and Health, and Hina was invited to join the Indian Council for Ethical AI. I watched their names rise not because of proximity to power, but because of proximity to proof. They weren't protégés, they were architects. One evening, after a long day of debugging regional routing errors, I received a call from Marcus Webb. It was the first time I'd heard his voice in nearly 2 years. "Isabella," he said gently, "there's something I thought you should know. Kristen Blackwood had passed away. Complications from an aggressive form of ovarian cancer diagnosed too late to treat." "She didn't leave many people behind," Marcus said. "But she left a note. And your name was in it." The next day, an envelope arrived at Quantum Forward's front desk. Inside was a single sentence, handwritten on the back of an old pitch memo. She was the system, and we tried to hack her. There was no name, no apology, just acknowledgement. Sarah read it once and said nothing, folding it and placing it in the drawer of my desk with the weight of history tucked away. Some ghosts don't need banishing, just filing. That winter, the Isabella Santos Initiative doubled its funding. Not because we had to, but because we could. $50 million earmarked for the next generation of engineers, architects, and silent revolutionaries who would never again have to ask permission to be heard. Sarah and I reviewed the applicant pool over chamomile tea in the lounge. "There's a kid in Peru who built a fetal monitoring sensor from scrap," she said, scrolling. "I want him on our team in 10 years. Let's make sure we're still worth joining by then," I replied. In the final week of December, I visited Elena's grave for the first time in a year. I brought her marigolds and a printed version of our WHO advisory panel recognition. I placed them beside her stone and sat on the bench with my journal. "You were right," I whispered. "They did try to erase me, but I built something too loud to delete." The wind moved softly across the cemetery, as if her answer came not in words but in peace. I left the grave with lighter steps than I'd arrived, walking toward a future shaped not by retaliation, but by reclamation. The systems I built weren't about revenge anymore. They were about permanence, a different kind of power, quiet, provable, and irrevocable, and they worked. The first morning of the new year, I brewed coffee in my quiet Cambridge kitchen, sunlight slicing across the floor like gold threads through linen. I had no resolutions, no plans to become someone else. I was already someone I could live with, finally. The Omega watch, still pristine in its case, sat on the shelf beside Elena's letter, no longer a symbol of betrayal but a relic from a story that had already ended. Some objects stay because they remind us not of who we lost, but of what we chose to never lose again. Sarah arrived just past 10, kicking snow from her boots as she held up 2 printed reports. Veritas Light just hit its 1,000,000th diagnostic, she said, handing me the report. And guess who submitted the 1,000,000th case? One of Henry's students flagged a neurodevelopmental risk and caught it before it was symptomatic. I smiled. That's what legacy looks like when it's passed on correctly. We had long since stopped asking where credit landed, because the math did that for us. Precision, recall, impact, these were our metrics now. Every saved life became a ledger entry that didn't need applause to be meaningful. There was no banner, no media campaign, no staged photo shoot, just logs, timestamps, and evidence that when systems are built ethically, they perform with the dignity of truth. Quantum Forward had grown to over 70 full-time contributors across 11 countries. Most worked remotely, building modules, testing regional variations, training data with local nuance. Kendi oversaw deployment protocols across Africa, while Hina led design for user interfaces in low connectivity environments. We didn't believe in centralization. We believed in mirrors, in giving people tools to reflect and repair their own systems. Every contributor had ownership, and every model we shipped included their signatures in the commit log. That spring, we opened our first campus lab, not in Boston, but in Bogota. Elena would have loved that. It sat inside a former textile factory repurposed for open-source research and technical education. We called it La Fabrica, and the wall by the entrance held a mural of her face surrounded by circuit diagrams and flowering vines. Build something that matters. It read in bright cobalt paint. The opening ceremony was attended by students, families, and community leaders. No press, no celebrities. At the event, a young girl named Valeria asked me if I had always known I was smart. I knelt beside her and said, "No, I just knew I didn't want to be ignored." She thought about that for a long time, then nodded, like it made sense in her bones. I gave her a Quantum Forward notebook and told her to write everything she ever wanted to build inside it. "And when you do," I said, "don't let anyone put their name on it but yours." After Bogota, we flew to Tokyo for the AI for Humanity Summit. This time, I agreed to speak on stage, not because I needed the platform, but because the topic was about global collaboration and decentralized design. I shared what we'd learned from Kosecha and Sutura, how peer accountability across borders outperformed top-down systems. I showed anonymized logs of early diagnoses, lives redirected with nothing more than a warning and a little trust. The room was quiet after I finished. No applause burst forward, just a breath held in collective understanding. After the panel, a professor from Kyoto University approached me. He asked if I would consider submitting Veritas as a case study in their new AI ethics curriculum. "You don't have to teach students how to code," he said. "You just have to teach them how not to lie about who did." I agreed on the spot. The truth didn't need protecting anymore. It needed passing on. Back in Cambridge, I hosted the second annual Assemblea. This time, over 100 contributors attended in person and more than 400 joined remotely. Sarah joked that we were accidentally becoming a movement. I corrected her gently. We were always a movement. We just stopped asking permission to be one. During the final day of the event, I stood at the front of the library-turned-lab, watching the next generation troubleshoot edge cases I hadn't even considered. They weren't waiting for instruction. They were improving what I had built. That was the moment I knew my work would outlive me, that I had created something not just worth remembering, but worth continuing, and I didn't need my name on every piece to know that. That night, I sat alone in my study, journal open, ink pen resting gently between my fingers. I flipped back through the pages, through the late nights, the breakthroughs, the letters I never sent, and the silence I'd chosen over spectacle. There were no more courtrooms to build, no more enemies to outmaneuver, just systems to refine and people to empower. For the first time, I wrote something that wasn't about the past or the company or the mission. I wrote about peace, about coffee in quiet kitchens, about laughter during data reviews, About colleagues who became family without needing ceremony, about legacies that feel more like seeds than statues, and about justice, not as revenge, but as restoration. Outside my window, snow began to fall again, soft and quiet. I looked down at the final page of the journal, then back at the Omega watch in its glass case. I reached for it and gently closed the lid, locking it not as evidence, but as artifact. The story was over, not ended, completed. I pressed my pen to the page and wrote my last entry. The system works. Thank you for listening to Isabella's story. If you're yet to subscribe, please consider doing so before watching another story on the channel.